When you see people raving online about an animated Spider-Man series, you'll more than likely hear them talking about one of two Spidey shows. If they're an older millennial like me, you'll more than likely hear them gushing over the amazing balance in tone and the character study of Peter Parker in the 90s series. If they're a younger millennial or a Gen Z person, it's safe to assume they'll be showing an outpour of love to the extremely unique character design and the mature storytelling of the Spectacular Spider-Man. Which honestly, I missed out on that show, but I'll get to it eventually, I promise. Regardless, a show I rarely hear anyone speaking about is the Ultimate Spider-Man series that came out in 2012. To say the least, this series is a mixed bag among Spidey fans all over the world. Even though I do love this show, I understand a lot of its criticisms. It was an obvious first attempt at creating parallels to the early stages of the MCU. There's a lot of Avengers talk throughout this show, and Spider-Man gets invited to S.H.I.E.L.D. and gets a bunch of tech upgrades within the first few episodes. Does that sound a little bit familiar? This version of Spider-Man clearly influenced the Tom Holland version a lot, so if you have gripes about Holland's version, you'll more than likely still have those same complaints here. Look, if you don't like this show, you don't like this show. I'm not gonna try to convince you that it's good. All I'm gonna do is try to explain why none of those things that I mentioned take away from who this version of Spider-Man is at its core. When making a superhero series or movie, I feel like one of the hardest things to decide would be where to start in the character's journey, especially when you're talking about one of the most popular characters of all time. When it comes to characters like Batman or Spider-Man, I don't always feel that an origin story is necessary because most people already know their beginnings. As long as the hero's origin story is mentioned or at bare minimum still holds some of the same influence over their future journey, I feel like it's okay to start in their second act, and I really like that they did that here. In this series, it's been implied that Spider-Man has been doing his thing for quite a while now. He's a well-established hero that everyone knows, even in a world where the Avengers exist. I mention this because it's one of a lot of people's main gripes about this show, his attachment to the Avengers and S.H.I.E.L.D. Which I always find it a little weird that a lot of those same people enjoy that aspect when it comes to MCU Spider-Man. There's a lot of similarities between this Ultimate Spider-Man and Tom Holland's version of the character. From the learning responsibility through working with a team, to the younger, more lighthearted tone, skipping the origin story, and most importantly being an Avengers recruit. But there's also a lot of key differences as well. See, this version of Peter Parker actually wants no part in being on a team. He's established himself as a hero already, so S.H.I.E.L.D. isn't just recruiting him to be a member, they're recruiting him so he can be a leader of a new young team of heroes. MCU Spider-Man's main goal at first is just being an Avenger. He's a very novice version of Spider-Man when we're introduced to him. He still has his homemade suit and all, and he doesn't get an official Spider-Man suit until Tony Stark makes him one. Another gripe a lot of people have about Tom Holland's version of the character is the lack of Uncle Ben. In this series, although we don't get a dramatic retelling of Uncle Ben and we don't get to see him when he's alive, he is mentioned and referenced a lot. Through flashbacks and sometimes even Peter's manifestation of his psyche, we're still able to see Uncle Ben and feel his presence a lot. For the most part, he acts as Peter's conscience throughout this series. See, if you're gonna do a Spider-Man in his second act, I feel like this is the perfect way to do it. You acknowledge the source material and other iterations of the character while also still providing a fresh and new take. Lastly, in comparison to MCU Spider-Man, a lot of people try to argue that this version of Peter doesn't have any real or relatable problems. They mainly say this because Agent Coulson ends up being the principal at his school, and S.H.I.E.L.D. pretty much runs the high school behind the scenes. And look, if you don't like that angle, I can respect that, but I don't think that that means that he automatically has no problems because of it. He still gets bullied at school, and even though he could easily fight back, he has to restrain his powers every single day. And sure, he has new gadgets and new tech for missions, but he still lives at home with his single mother and Aunt May. It's not like S.H.I.E.L.D. is paying all of their bills. Then there's Mary Jane and Harry, his friends. They still don't know his secret. He's still having to balance that double life every single day. So although his problems may be different, they're still very unique to Peter Parker as a character. So let's get into people's main gripe about this series. It's comedy. If you watch a video from someone who doesn't like this show, the majority of it is gonna spend time bragging on the comedy. And look, man, what's funny is subjective. If you don't like it, I get it. But it has a charm to me. Does it venture off into the territory of being cheesy and corny sometimes? Of course it does. But for me, I like it because it makes him feel like a lonely, insecure, and misunderstood high school kid. Like, just imagine what it would be like to be one of the most popular and loved superheroes in the world when you're out swinging around saving the city, but when you go to school and live your everyday life, you're looked at as a weirdo by the majority of your peers. I feel like that would create a really isolated and weird sense of self. On one hand, you would probably have this really high, false sense of confidence, but on the other, you'd feel like a total loser. I think the comedy and the skits depict that in a very cool way. I like how we get a peek into Peter Parker's thoughts and his psyche. And as childish and cartoonish as it may be to have an angel and devil version of Spider-Man as his conscience, it also makes a lot of sense that someone that feels this level of isolation would imagine that. The comedy is frequent, but for me, it doesn't take away from the emotional moments. When there's a message that the show wants to get across, whether it be Peter Parker being down on himself, feeling inadequate, or having a lot of rage build up inside of him because he wants to stand up to bullies like Flash Thompson, they do a good job of letting him really sit and feel those emotions. In season 1, when the show was finding its footing, the comedy definitely came off heavy-handed at times. And this outlook on it may be just me being a fan of the show, but my outlook on it is, I see it as Peter Parker using his sense of humor to hide his insecurities and his pain. As the show went on and Peter grew up to become more confident, the childish things like imaginary Spidey friends and the frequent cutaway gags happened less and less. And whether that was the plan from the beginning or the writers just learning their lesson from fan complaints, I think that deserves some credit. But as for the overall tone, I definitely can understand a lot of people's disappointment, seeing how this was a follow-up to the more mature tone of the Spectacular Spider-Man series. Who knows, maybe if I had watched that series back in the day, I'd feel the same way. But for me, the lighthearted tone made those emotional beats hit even harder. Now, I know a lot of people didn't like the team-up aspect or the web warriors of this series, and normally I probably wouldn't like that aspect either. I don't know if it's because Spider-Man is appointed to be the leader or what, but I actually enjoyed that aspect of the show. I enjoyed the rivalry between Spider-Man and Nova. I don't know much about Nova as a comic book character, so I can't speak on if they got his characterization right, but I like him here. Him and Peter have this love-hate relationship, very similar to that of like some young stepbrothers. I also like this different take on the Harry Osborn and Peter Parker friendship. I like that they first meet in this series and they're not friends beforehand. That would make a lot of sense seeing how Spider-Man is more considered to be an outcast or a nerd and Harry is considered to be more popular. I like that they did it this way because you can really see their friendship blossom over time and it seems really genuine and organic. It also gave some real weight to the Norman Osborn plot in season 1. He's looking to create an army using Spider-Man's blood. For a show with a lighter tone, man, I was really surprised how ruthless they made Norman Osborn. He doesn't give a damn about Harry at all in this series. He only starts to pay any attention to him when he finds out Harry has the Venom symbiote. And the only reason he cares is because it puts him one step closer to making his army. Also, Norman's arc in general throughout the series is pretty dope to watch. He goes from the power-hungry Norman Osborn to the Green Goblin, and eventually even the Iron Patriot later in the seasons. I thought the Luke Cage or Power Man, whatever you want to call him, was cool. Even though I wasn't a huge fan of his origin story being changed to his parents were S.H.I.E.L.D. agents, I thought the episodes where they explored that were pretty entertaining. I thought his voice actor was great and did perfect, but all in all, he wasn't soloed in on enough for me to fall in love with or dislike his character. As for White Tiger, I really wasn't familiar with her character before watching, so I was really intrigued by her character in general. Anytime the story ventured off into her backstory, I was all for it. The Kraven the Hunter episode was done perfect in my opinion, and I wish we got a little bit more of it. And as for Mary Jane, look, I know a lot of people wanted the Mary and Peter relationship, but I'm one of those few people who don't think a superhero story necessarily needs an underlying romance story. I like that they were just friends here. It made for some really cute and innocent moments between them. For Flash Thompson, man, I thought his character was handled well overall. I like how he was more than just a bully, and they actually gave his character some depth and a real character arc as the series went on. His Agent Venom story was a little bit rushed, but it was really fun to watch when it finally got into it. I really like the Agent Venom character design, and when I think about Agent Venom in my head, I think about this version of the character. On the surface, the character of Iron Fist just seems like a really extremely chill dude that's always dropping a bunch of zen quotes, but he has some of my favorite moments in the show, especially the Journey of the Iron Fist episode. It was one of the more interesting and compelling episodes of the series. It gave us a bit of mystery and suspense and a little magic in the dark arts. I like how Spider-Man had to do a lot of detective work to figure out what the heck was going on with Danny. That's an aspect of Spider-Man we really don't get to see a lot. But the unspoken MVP and one of my favorite characters in the series is gonna have to be old Stan Lee. Rewatching this series now that Stan Lee has passed, man, just really warms my heart, and every time he pops on the screen, it just makes me feel like a kid again. So in this series, Stan Lee's character is a S.H.I.E.L.D. agent in disguise as a janitor. I like pretty much every scene that Stan Lee was in this series. They were all good to me.
The amazing Spider-Man battles the loathsome lizard in one of the most daringly dramatic hassles to date.
Last but not least, man, Nick Fury was great as well. He really pushed Spider-Man to be a better hero, and I thought Chi McBride's voice acting was extremely on point. I like that he was an integral part of the series and even had story arcs and beats of his own, but he didn't overpower Spider-Man. For the most part, I liked all the main characters, but it admittedly got a little tough to get invested with all of the newer young heroes that were introduced later. Last but not least, man, we gotta get into the fan service. The term fan service gets a bad rap when we're talking about comic book media. Every time someone talks about it, it's talked about in a negative light. Fan service can be a bad thing when it's empty. And sure, there are a few uses of empty fan service in here, but for the most part, the majority of it felt meaningful and seemed to push the main storyline forward in a cool way. The first bit of fan service that we get, and honestly one of my favorite jokes in this series, comes in season 1, where we get introduced to Dr. Connors working as a S.H.I.E.L.D. agent.
Yes. Awkward. A pleasure. I've followed your career closely. Very impressive.
I like this guy.
That was a really subtle and funny joke. Another one of my favorite bits of fan service is the Guardians of the Galaxy episodes, because this actually came out before the film. I really like that first introduction to them because it gives us a little bit of a deep dive and background into the character of Nova. Spider-Man and Nova have this playful rivalry throughout the series, and you can kind of tell that Spider-Man, even though they are friends, he doesn't respect him very much as a hero. So with the introduction of the Guardians and showing a little bit of Nova's backstory and them talking about some of his past adventures with the Guardians, it really makes Spider-Man stop and look and appreciate Nova as a hero, and most importantly, put a little bit more respect on his name. And lastly but not least, my favorite bit of fan service in this is going to have to be the Spider-Verse episode. We had Spider-Man New War, we had Spider-Ham. I wish we would have got Spider-Gwen, but we just basically got an alternate version of Peter Parker as a girl. We had Miles Morales voiced by Childish Gambino, which is an extremely meta callback. There was a script in Hollywood a long time ago, around the time when Donald Glover was in Community. There was a rumor that he was going to be cast as Spider-Man Miles Morales. So I really liked that little nugget and callback. It was one of my favorite episodes, and most importantly, man, we got introduced to Spider-Man 2099. Next to Peter Parker, Spider-Man 2099 is my favorite version of the character. This episode was extremely dope, and I like how that when they went into the different worlds of the different versions of Spider-Man, the animation changed. People talk about this episode sometimes if it was just meh or okay, but it was a two-parter and I thought it was handled perfect, and for me it's one of the most memorable episodes of the series. And that's me pleading my case on why I enjoyed the Ultimate Spider-Man series so much. Look, whether you agree or disagree with me is completely irrelevant. This show was clearly made for a younger audience, and at the end of the day, it got a whole new generation of kids into the character of Spider-Man. And if you're a true Spidey fan, at the end of the day, that's all that should matter.